Greetings, everyone. My name is Christina, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the Washington Labs Academy webinar series. We hope you find the next hour or so useful and informative. We've developed our webinar series to deal with some of the technical and administrative issues that our customers face on a day-to-day basis. We recognize that engineering challenges can be complex, and we're always looking for ways to support the technology industry. Before we begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping details. First, I hope everyone is able to see the title slide on their computer. We have muted everyone's microphone to keep the meeting quality as high as possible. A recording of the presentation is underway and will be sent to all attendees along with a certificate of attendance. We will go through all questions at the end of the presentation as time permits. A full screen view may be preferred. Your selection at your computer can be done using the menu panel. In the menu on your screen, go to View and then select Full Screen. We estimate the main bulk of the presentation will take about an hour, and we will allow some time for questions at the end. We do encourage questions during the presentation. You may submit a question by enabling the chat icon at the top or side of your screen and typing your question to the host. And we'd like to hear from you. You can contact us via phone or email, or you may contact the presenter directly. Send your emails to michaeld@acbcert.com. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Michael Derby is a Senior Review Engineer and Director at American Certification Body in Europe. He's been with ACB since November 2007. Michael is a TCB for the FCC, an FCB for Industry Canada, and a notified body for the R&TTE Directive, EMC, and RE Directives. Michael is an active member of the REDCA and TCB Council, acting as liaison between the two organizations. He is also the chairman of the TCB Council Board of Directors. He is the secretary of the EMC Test Lab Association, responsible for education on testing methods and standards development. Michael's past experience includes product development, testing, and certification for test laboratories and manufacturers. Michael provides worldwide services to ACB's global customers from his office in the Hampshire area of the UK. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand over the presentation to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much, Christina. I hope you can hear me okay.
I hear you loud and clear.
Okay, are you going to mute yourself? I'm getting a little bit of crackly sound back.
Sure am.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I hope everybody can hear me okay. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to move quite quickly through these first few slides because I think you didn't come here to hear about me. But I'm looking at the attendee list. I can see some friends and acquaintances on there and some people that I've dealt with before, so it's nice to be speaking with you now. Okay, so as Christina said, I work for American Certification Body, and we're basically a notified body and a certification body. We deal with certifications, but also compliance management, international approvals, and helping manufacturers to plan their testing. That's something we haven't really needed to do too much in the past, and now all of a sudden everybody wants to know which tests they need to perform, and you'll probably see why towards the end of these slides. We have offices all around the world: UK, Netherlands, Finland, USA, China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And I'm in one of our UK offices. My own personal background, as Christina said, I started work for a manufacturer, developing and testing their own products for EMC. I was at a commercial test lab for about 16 years, based in the USA and Europe, and now I'm with ACB. In the past, I have taken part in writing ETSI standards, but I'll have to caveat that I've not been doing that lately. Okay, now I'm with ACB. I'm one of our review engineers, which basically means that I do these technical reviews on a day-to-day basis. I do the reviews for notified body work, for the R&TTE and RED mostly, but also the EMC Directive, and I'm a certification body for Canada and the USA. Okay, as Christina mentioned, I am the TCB Council Chairman of the Board of Directors. I get involved with the REDCA and the EMC Test Lab Association. Okay, so that's enough about me, I think. Let's move on to the presentation. Well, haven't we been here before? I feel like when I was first asked, could you give a presentation about the RED, I thought, I cannot believe that there's a single person on this planet who hasn't heard me give a presentation about the RED. The good compliance folks of this world are sick of the sound of my voice by now. They don't need to hear any more. But then I turn on my emails in the morning and I see all the questions, and I think, yeah, maybe, just maybe, everything isn't quite clear enough yet. So, yeah, we've talked about this before. In fact, I'm sure some of you have even heard me talk about this before, but it's not 100% clear. And a lot of that is because the details are changing. The directive itself hasn't changed for a long time, but some of the guidance and standards has changed. So we'll talk a bit about that today. But we're all experts about it by now. The directive is pretty old. We lay awake at night dreaming about it, so we're all pretty expert. So let's have a little look at what questions do arise still. Okay, so let's have a look at the agenda for the next hour. First of all, I want to make a reminder about the timeline. This seems like a real simple fundamental point, but it is also very important. And a lot of people still want clarification on which products apply. I'm suspecting that there's an element of wanting to check that fact because you don't want to believe that fact. And that's fine, by the way. Then we'll talk through a reminder of some of the common issues. And these are some slides that you might have seen in previous presentations. And really, I guess I could call it a frequently asked questions section. Then we'll talk about some latest developments. And really, that would be the RED guide. And this is a guidance document that will accompany the RED so that we all know how it works. Then we'll talk a little bit about the practical approach. You know, what can a manufacturer actually do right now? I see some notified bodies on the call. So again, you know, what can a notified body be doing right now? And test labs too. And then finally, I'll have a look at some of the standards and we'll talk about the status of some of the standards. Okay, so Radio Equipment Directive, it replaced the R&TTE Directive on the 13th of June 2016. But it did allow a transition period of 1 year. So even though officially the R&TTE Directive was repealed on the 13th of June 2016, you can continue to use it up until the 12th of June 2017 if you wish. And a lot of the EU directives were amended or recast, was the expression at the time. And that was really a lot of the time just sort of aligning the text and making sure they all said similar things, and keeping up to date with some of the compliance issues, market surveillance, etc. However, with the Radio Equipment Directive, there is really some much more significant changes, changes of scope and essential requirements, for example. Okay, so when I said we're all experts, that's because, I apologize, there seems to be some formatting going on here. On my screen, I can see publication of the Radio Equipment I'm going to guess that is directive, and hopefully that will look correct on the slides you have. I hope this isn't the shape of things to come. The directive was published in May 2014, hence the name 2014 53 EU. And it is known as the RED. The D of RED means directive, Radio Equipment Directive. So it's not the RED Directive. That's just my own personal pet hate. Okay, so let's look at the timeline from the R&TTE Directive to the Radio Equipment Directive. Well, firstly, there are very many similarities, and a lot of things haven't changed. So the directive covers safety, EMC, and radio. And it's a declaration of conformity style directive, not certification. That applied to the R&TTE and the RED, exactly the same. So no change there. And the basic compliance approaches, they're the same too. You can either fully apply harmonized standards, sign your declaration of conformity and not need a notified body, or you can apply standards, be they harmonized or not, and then get a review from a notified body. Or, and this is quite a rare case, you can have a full quality assurance route whereby you have your quality system assessed and a notified body takes part in that. And there's really not too many manufacturers deal with that. So there's a lot of similarities between the R&TTE and radio equipment directives, but there are some differences, and we'll revisit some of the important ones today. Well, we're almost halfway through the transition period now, so I'm guessing that you're all using the RED. Everyone has reassessed all their products, and the market has been flooded with RED compliant products. Well, actually no, I would say not. Whenever I speak to notified bodies, they're really not issuing certificates yet to the radio equipment directive, and when I speak to manufacturers, they're not really applying the directive very much yet either. And we'll talk a little bit about why that might be, and mostly it's going to be due to the lack of standards to test to, the lack of guidance, and also an uncertainty about the product's future. So for example, in most cases, the requirements for the RED are tougher than the requirements for the R&TTE directive. And so if there's a chance that a product might reach its end of life before the end of the transition period, then there wouldn't really be a requirement to assess it to the RED. Okay, so the RED has been officially in use since the 13th of June 2016. And right now, in this one-year transition phase, any product entering onto the market can use the R&TTE directive or the radio equipment directive. However, by the 13th of June 2017, any product still being placed on the market must meet the RED. So that means that any product where you are still shipping or still selling units of that model, they would need to meet the RED before the 13th of June 2017. This doesn't mean you need to go out there and recall and snatch radios out of people's hands and tell them you need to take them back to the factory and reassess them. Any product that's out there on the market, that's there, it doesn't need to be recalled. That applies to products that are in the user's hand, but also if you sell to a store or a vendor and it's on their shelves already waiting for Christmas, well, that's on the market. Even though the end user may not have it in their hands yet, that's on the market. So a new unit of an existing model must comply with the RED, and being placed on the market is per individual unit, it's not per model number. So now we'll move on to the common differences that I see between the R&TTE and radio equipment directives. And these are the slides you might have seen before, because these are the questions that I still receive on a pretty much daily basis. Just checking I didn't do 2 slides there. Yeah. Okay, so firstly, the radio equipment directive does include EMC and safety. So there's an article for EMC and safety and an article for radio. So if you have a product, let's say a laptop that's got Wi-Fi in it, under the old R&TTE directive, only the R&TTE directive would have applied to that. The EMC and low voltage or safety directives would not have applied to that laptop, because EMC and safety were covered under the R&TTE. And that's exactly the same with the radio equipment directive. So if you have a product like a laptop or overhead projector or a washing machine or something, it's a radio product, and EMC and safety is covered with that. So there's no change there. Now, there is a small text change in that in the R&TTE directive, it kind of said that if there's a radio part is easily removable from a host, then you could assess them separately. So you could have a radio product that plugs into the host, and then in that case, maybe the host would be EMC and low voltage directives, and then the radio part would be a radio product. That text has been removed from the RED, and the implication therefore is that there'll be more RED products, because where you have a combination of radio and non-radio, it's clearer now that the whole system would be a RED product. However, there is some discussion about clarifying that in the RED guide to make sure it doesn't get too out of hand. Okay, what's in a name? Well, it was called the R&TTE Directive, and now it's the RE Directive. The TT has gone. So telecommunications terminal equipment. If you have a wired telephone or a fax machine, for example, that was within scope of the R&TTE Directive, but it's out of scope of the radio equipment directive. And as soon as it comes out of scope of the radio equipment directive, it falls down into scope for the EMC and low voltage directives. And now, of course, if your fax machine happened to have a Bluetooth module inside it, then it would automatically jump back up into the Radio Equipment Directive, and the sort of fax or telecom parts would be assessed under the EMC sections of the Radio Equipment Directive. But in general, the Radio Equipment Directive now only applies to wireless or radio products. The scope of transmission has been clarified. Under the R&TTE Directive, it was always understood that it covered radio communications, but it was never too clear about radio determination, and that left things like RFID and movement detection and velocity measurement, radar, a little bit unclear as to where that fell. Well, that's been clarified now, and that does indeed fall into the scope of the Radio Equipment Directive. And the only transmitters that would not be under the scope of the Radio Equipment Directive would be products that use RF for a function, such as ISM or CISPA 11 type devices. If you're American, try and think FCC Part 18. Scope of radio reception. So receive-only radio equipment is still in scope. So no change there, but there was a discussion of removing it, so I've left this slide in just to make it clear. Under the old R&TTE Directive, if you had a short-range device receiver or a GPS receiver, for example, that was in scope of the R&TTE Directive, and that remains in scope for the Radio Equipment Directive as before. In fact, receiver operation has become a major focus point of a discussion point also for the Radio Equipment Directive, and we'll have a look at that in just a moment. Broadcast receivers are now in scope. So receivers were in scope of the R&TTE Directive, but broadcast sound and TV receivers were specifically excluded. Well, they're not excluded from the red, and therefore they end up in scope. So this will affect television and AM, FM radio receivers that now come out of the EMC and low voltage directives and into the Radio Equipment Directive. That's going to be maybe quite an abrupt shock for some of those manufacturers. The EMC and safety testing would probably be very similar, but as we'll see in a while, there will be some receiver tests that they've not had to think about before. With regard to receiver performance, this all comes from a section of the Radio Equipment Directive which requires efficient use of spectrum. Because there is a correlation, or at least there has been identified a correlation between receiver efficiency and the efficiency of spectrum use. Basically, if your receiver is good, then you can adjust your transmit power accordingly, and everything comes down a little bit, and you can perhaps reuse that channel again nearby. And if your channel selectivity is pretty good, then you can use the adjacent channels nearby. And if your receiver blocking performance is good, then your receiver will continue to work well, even while other radios are all around it. This may seem like a quality issue, but this is future-proofing the directive, where we look ahead and we think, right, well, the R&TTE Directive was in use for a good 16 or so years. What is the radio world going to look like in that length of time? And the result of this is that the EU Commission has instructed ETSI to include receiver tests into their standards. Basically any test for spectrum sharing. So in some cases there are additional transmitter tests, duty cycle and spectrum sharing, sort of like the adaptivity tests we've seen over the last few years. But in all cases, there's a requirement to add receiver performance, at the very least something like receiver blocking, such that the receiver will continue to work even in the presence of nearby radios. And as I say, this is all part of planning ahead to a time when we know there'll be radios everywhere, and we want our radio infrastructure to still work correctly. It's important to note that this is an essential requirement of the Radio Equipment Directive. This isn't just some whimsical idea made up by ETSI. Okay, the frequency range of the Radio Equipment Directive has changed. The R&TTE Directive was 9 kilohertz to 3,000 gigahertz. That's not a typing error, that really is 3,000 gigahertz. The frequency range of the red, it just says up to 3,000 gigahertz with no lower limit. There are communications below 9 kilohertz, and these were previously in scope of the EMC and low voltage directives. But now, of course, they leave the scope of the EMC and low voltage directives, and they come into scope for the radio equipment directive. ETSI has been working hard to create test standards, and the European Communications Office must write up spectrum allocations for those bands. I can tell you that they've created a general short-range device standard. So you know how you have 300/440 for high-frequency short-range devices, and then EN300/220 for like 30 megahertz to 1 gigahertz, and then you have EN300/330 for 9 kilohertz to 30 megahertz. Well, they've created a new standard to go from basically 0 hertz up to 9 kilohertz, and they created the standard, but nobody turned up to write it. So the standard isn't mature yet, and it suggests that nobody is interested in it. But there have been some specific standards written for specific technology types down below 9 kilohertz. And in fact, recently I was at a meeting where the European Commission were asked, why? Why did you do this? Why did you remove that 9 kilohertz threshold? And the answer was simply, well, why should we have it in? If a radio device uses radio frequency to communicate, it should come under the red, regardless of the lower frequency. Okay, protection for animals. If you had read the R&TTE Directive carefully and you had followed its conclusion down like a regulatory Sherlock Holmes, you might have concluded that animals were covered by it. But it wasn't very clear, and most people gave up at a much earlier stage. But to clarify this, the Radio Equipment Directive specifies the protection of health and safety of persons and of domestic animals and the protection of property. So protection of persons, I think that's probably common to all of us. I don't think too many surprises there. Domesticated animals, that's a clarification, I guess, and just needed to be made. I'm guessing the next debate will obviously be what is a domesticated animal, but that's probably not my job to discuss that. And then protection of property is an interesting thing, and I guess you could talk about walking around a car park, hitting your key fob and hoping that all the cars don't unlock. But probably more seriously, that's to do with all of the data transaction security and social media and all of our private information that we have on our wireless devices these days. Okay, here's an interesting expression, reasonably foreseen use. The R&TTE Directive talks about making sure a product is compliant for its intended use, which makes perfect sense. But the Radio Equipment Directive goes a step further and says intended use and reasonably foreseen use. Now, it's important for the manufacturer, the test lab, and the notified body to think about how it will be used, not just about how the instructions to the user are worded. Really, this is just a case of don't hide behind user manuals. You know, you can't police against every possible eventuality, but as the expression goes, you know, you can make something foolproof, but never underestimate the ingenuity of fools. But if you think about how something could be used, and if you're keeping a close eye on the state of the art, and you see how people begin to use your products, then that becomes an important part of your assessment. And this reasonably foreseen use expression, this comes from a few things. It's really safety-based. You could say that it applies to EMC and radio, but the history of it is in the Article 3.1a for safety. And part of it is simply to align with the text of other safety directives or other directives that include safety. They all have this expression, reasonably foreseen use. So for a start, it would be improper for the red not to include that text. But it's also a good way of putting into text what people should probably have been doing anyway, to make sure that improper or unsafe use of a product is avoided. And we've seen some examples of this creeping in recently, whereby, for example, in Europe, a mobile phone must be tested at 5 millimeters for body SAR, regardless of whether the manufacturer insists it would always be used in a holster or not. Okay, some admin changes. Under the R&TTE Directive, the CE mark must appear on the product and in the user manual and on the packaging. Under the Radio Equipment Directive, the CE mark must appear on the product and on the packaging. There's actually no mandatory requirement for it to be in the user manual under the RED. It's not prohibited, but it's not mandated either. Under the under the R&TTE Directive, if there was any involvement of a notified body whatsoever, whether they helped you identify the test suites, or if they gave you a review and a notified body opinion, or if they took part in your full quality assurance assessment, then that notified body's number would appear on the label of your product. And when I say that, I mean the label and the user manual and the packaging. Anywhere the CE mark appeared, the notified body number would also appear. Under the RED, however, that changes. There is a requirement that if you use the full quality assurance route, then you do still use the notified body's number. But as I said, that is very rare. And so in the most cases that happen in the market where the notified body does a review and issues a document as an output, then under the RED, you do not put the notified body's number on the label or on the packaging. The notified body number would only appear therefore on the label when the full quality assurance route is used, and is not included when a notified body review has been performed and a certificate issued. This isn't an option because it's pretty clear. If you tried to put the notified body number on your product just because you wanted to, it would send the wrong message. It would tell market surveillance that you were using the full quality assurance route, and that would be incorrect. Who recognizes this lovely symbol and who will miss it when it's gone? And who indeed knows what it even means? No more alert symbol for Class 2 devices. As I hope you know, under the R&TTE Directive, you have Class 1 devices and Class 2 devices. Class 1 devices can be turned on anywhere, placed into service anywhere without restriction in the EU market, of course. Whereas a Class 2 device is some product that has some sort of restriction. Maybe that's it doesn't use a harmonized frequency band, or maybe it can only be used indoors, or maybe it requires a license. But if some restriction exists, that symbol must appear on it, and it's Class 2. But under the Radio Equipment Directive, this symbol does not exist, and that will go away. So there will be no immediate way to tell if a product is Class 2 or not. However, of course, if it is Class 2 because of a lack of harmonization of its frequency band around the EU, well, you still need to make it very clear to the user how, which country they are allowed to use it in. This is covered in Article 10.10 of the Radio Equipment Directive, and I will say right now that the requirement for solving it is not actually clear yet. There's a proposal to have a little pictogram or table of all the different country codes, but right now it's not been finalized of how you should achieve that. The fact that it's not been finalized, of course, you could say the bad news is nobody's telling you how to do it, but the good news is nobody's telling you how you mustn't do it. Okay, no more country notifications for Class 2. Well, under the R&TTE Directive, if you had a Class 2 device that used a non-harmonized frequency band, you were required to do a country notification. And that meant telling all the EU member states that you plan to sell the radio into Europe. And this has the effect that they would have 4 weeks to come back to you and say, no, you can't. We don't want your product on our market. And that was supposed to be the process, but actually in the most cases, it was used as almost like a consultancy tool or something where people would say, well, let's just send off the country notification. We'll see what comes back, and then we'll know which country it can be sold into. For whatever reason, that's ending. For various reasons, I suspect, that's ending. And the country notifications will not exist under the RED. You'll still be, a manufacturer will still be mandated to list which countries it can be sold in the case of Class 2 equipment, but the manufacturer will be expected to use the electronic frequency information system online to do that research themselves and to have that information. It is considered that that information is now easily available online, and the manufacturer should easily be able to find that. Personally, I'm questioning the use of the word easily because I use it and I still find it a little struggle. So I do know that the ECO are working hard to improve it all the time. Okay, the notified body certificate. Under the R&TTE Directive, the document you would receive from a notified body was called a notified body opinion. It was a very descriptive word because it reminded you that it was their opinion. It was not a certification. But actually there were very few directives in the EU that used the word opinion. Most of them used either type examination certificate or type approval certificate. So under the red, the name of the notified body's output document has been changed to type examination certificate. Now the clue is in the word examination, which basically means that they've examined it, and it's not to be confused with an approval certificate, which is more of a certification idea. Under the red, this process is still required if harmonized radio standards are not fully applied. So as I'll clarify this on some later slides, but if a manufacturer uses harmonized standards, they do not need a notified body. If they do not use harmonized radio standards for the red, then they do need a notified body. Use of a notified body is not mandatory when using non-harmonized EMC or safety standards, or if they deviate from the EMC or safety standards. This is a change from the R&TTE Directive. Under the R&TTE Directive, any deviation from any of the standards required a notified body opinion. And just for your information, that was a mistake, by the way. That was never the original intention of the R&TTE Directive. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a quick sip of my cup of tea. It's very English of me. Okay, some more about the notified body certificate. Certificate issuance will be tracked. So this, and conversely, certificate non-issuance must also be tracked. So for example, if a notified body sees a product and does not issue the certificate, then they need to inform all the other notified bodies that they have not issued a certificate, so that the other notified bodies know about it. It might prevent the other notified bodies from repeating research that the first notified body has already performed, but it also might prevent the second notified body accidentally issuing a certificate or incorrectly issuing a certificate for a product where the other notified body had raised some problems. Now, this isn't the case if, say, somebody submits a set of documents to the notified body, and I don't know, they've used the wrong resolution bandwidth on their emissions test, or their label looks wrong or something. This doesn't mean that the notified body suddenly needs to run around and tell everybody. You know, this is just tidying up your documentation. That isn't refusing to issue a certificate. Refusing to issue a certificate might be something like a completely new type of technology that comes along into a new band, and they say, right, you know, this is how we're going to work, this is what our product does, and the notified body realizes that it will not comply with the directive, and so they say, I'm sorry, but I can't issue a certificate for this product. And that would be the sort of case. Or if a notified body has issued a certificate and then they find that the state of the art has changed, that they would inform the other notified bodies that they've had to recall their certificate. This is going to be handled over a database which is being set up as we speak. Only notified bodies will see the database, so it will be private. Manufacturers won't be able to go in there and look at their competitors. The public won't be able to see it. Even market surveillance may or should not be able to see it. In theory, it should only be the notified bodies. Now you can see I'm being slightly cautious with my words here to state. I don't want to state exactly how something will happen when it hasn't been finalized yet, but you can see how it's going. Okay, registration. There was talk of product registration appearing in the red from the beginning. It hasn't appeared from the beginning, but there's a hook, if you like, for it to be in there, and it should become applicable from the 12th of June 2018. Presently, the list of products that would require registration is blank. It's a little bit like Santa's naughty list. If you get on the naughty list, then your product may require registration from the 12th of June, and that would mean telling the European Commission what your product is, what your model is, and how where you plan to sell it. So I think it would be wise to avoid that. Some changes to the user manual. Technical information must be included in the user manual, such as the frequency range, the output power, and this is really to help market surveillance, because they pick a product off the shelf, they want to assess it without conversing with the manufacturer, and so they need to know what the output power is meant to be and what the frequency range is meant to be. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of this comes from the documentation might go to a notified body where they say it uses this frequency band and this output power, and it looks great to the notified body. And then the final product they sell allows buttons to push to extend the frequency range or increase the output power. And they want to know where the problem is. Did the problem exist at the review stage or at the final product stage? Accessories and other influencing factors must also be listed in the user manual, and we hope that this will be explained in more detail when the red guide comes out. Okay, so let's talk about that red guide. Firstly, the most recent draft of the red guide came from the 31st of October 2016, so that's pretty recent. This isn't a technical term, this is my words, very draft. I don't know if draft is something that you get different severity levels of, but I've called it very draft. Even to the point that you look at it and there's sections where there's literally just a piece of highlighted text that says, we need to write something here, or input needed. So in some cases, they've literally added a heading with a question mark and what shall we write next to it. So it's not even a public document yet, but notified bodies have all received it, and many of the big manufacturing groups should have received it. If anybody would like to see a copy of the draft red, I don't think it's confidential, I'd be happy to share it. It's being written by ADCO Red, and that's the Market Surveillance Coordination Group, and then it will be officially checked and released by the EU Commission. Personally, I think this is a very good idea, because let's face it, as a manufacturer, who are you worried about? Are you worried about the guys at the European Commission? You're not really. You're worried about the market surveillance. You're worried about the people who are going to actually check your product on the street and on the shelves. So the fact that the guidance is written by them, I think, is just going to help us all. So the market surveillance folks are writing the guidance, and then the Commission will issue it. And then, of course, the good news then is that hopefully when market surveillance pluck your product from the market, they should be checking it to the guidance that you've all seen. It's very important to note that the guidance will not change the directive. The guidance cannot change the directive. It can only be used to explain the directive. I see comments from people saying, "Oh, I wonder if the guidance will extend the transition period," or "I wonder if the guidance will remove the receiver testing." It can't. Those things are written in the directive, and the guidance cannot overrule the directive. Okay, so there are some concerns about how long the guide is taking. When I spoke to Market Surveillance Group recently, they did point out that the R&TTE Directive was published in 1999, and the R&TTE Directive Guide came out in 2009. So that's 10 years. So they think they're doing okay so far with the red guide. But some of the topics in the guide are pretty clear-cut and not too controversial. But some of the topics obviously are going backward and forward. You can imagine the sort of things like installing a radio module into a product, for example. Those are the topics that are not going to be easily solved overnight. So the plan is to release a version 1 of the guide, which will include only the topics that have no controversy or no arguments, and hopefully the next draft of that will be out around February 2017. And that should be a stable enough draft to appear on the European Commission's website. Even once they put that out, they will continue then to work on those controversial issues, and when they've been solved, a release 2 version of the guide would come out. As for a timeline of that, well, I guess you're going to ask, how long does it take a bunch of people to finish an argument? Engineers and politicians. So there we are. I can't put a number to that. Okay, so let's quickly talk about some of the topics. involved in the red guide. So obviously general issues relevant to all the EU directives are in the blue guide. Not to be confused with the red guide. Red is an acronym for Radio Equipment Directive. Blue is a color. So the blue guide covers all of the EU directives, and it includes things like placing on the market, or CE marking, or responsible parties and manufacturers' responsibilities. Those things are all covered in the blue guide, and you can click on the European Commission website right now and get the formally issued blue guide. So the red guide will only cover Radio Equipment Directive specific items, in the same way that the EMC guide will only cover the EMC Directive items. Some of the topics are quite simple and some of them are not so simple. ADCO, the group writing the guide, has said that they receive so many comments all the time that it's impossible for them to finish it quickly, because every time they write something, the comments come flooding in. This is obviously a 1-hour webinar, and so we can't go through the whole guide in itself. Like I say, I'm happy to send it to you, but I could go over it now and it might be different tomorrow. So I'll just list some of the main topics and you can read it at your leisure. Definition of the radio, placing on the market specific to radios, or turning a radio on, transmitting it, for example. Equipment which are excluded from the red, the transition period, the Radio Equipment Directive's relationship with other directives, the conformity assessment procedure for the red, the technical documentation. Under the R&TTE Directive, you would have got used to the term TCF, or technical construction file. Under the red, it's called a technical documentation, but it's really the same thing. The red guide talks about the declaration of conformity and the type examination certificate, packaging and labeling, market surveillance, non-compliances and enforcement. The essential requirements of the red, legal acts and that the EU Commission may take, such as enabling this registration system, for example. Class 1 and Class 2 devices, restrictions applying to Class 2 devices, the notified bodies' actions and their coordination and the exchange of information between notified bodies, and the type examination certificates. Changes to labeling, which are specific to the red, for example, the alert symbol and the notified body number, and the obligations and responsibilities for all of the economic operators. That would be the manufacturer, if they issue somebody to be their authorized representative, the importer and the distributor. By the way, I often get asked about this authorized representative. This is something where if a manufacturer chooses that somebody else will represent them, then that is a title there. But it doesn't mean that if you're a foreign manufacturer, you have to have an in-country representative. That's not the case. But it does mean that the importer, at the point of import into the EU, they do take on all the legal responsibility for the compliance of that product. Okay, so specific types of equipment needed guidance. So in general, the red guide obviously covers all radio equipment, but there's little sections for different types of equipment, and I've listed some of the key ones here. Okay, so complying with the red, that's all fine. But what do I actually do? So you go back to the office and you say, the webinar was interesting. Thankfully, it was only an hour long. And the boss says, okay, so what do we do? And you say, oh, God, I don't know. I'm not really sure. So what do we actually do? Well, I'm hoping that some of you are probably familiar with how the R&TTE Directive works, whereby you test your product. If you test to a harmonized standard, then you can say, right, I've complied with the harmonized standards. This has given me presumption of conformity, and you sign your declaration of conformity. And then if you cannot use a harmonized standard, then you would have to go to a notified body. And as I said, the approach is really the same, but what can you do right now for the red? So firstly, you need to meet those essential requirements of the red for your product, and this applies whether your product is an old one, which you still plan to keep selling, or a completely new product which you're just bringing to the market. Well, of course, you're going to have to test it. You're going to have to label it and DOC it correctly, and then you need to wonder if you need a notified body certificate. How do you demonstrate compliance to the red? Can I just change my DOC? If you've got an old product which is already selling to the R&TTE Directive doesn't mean that you just go and delete that line of 1999 5EC and type in 2014 53 EU. Are there any new tests or are there any new standards? So what do I actually have to do? Okay, right, well, let's start with which products will need a reassessment or a new assessment. So if my product was already compliant to the R&TTE Directive, can I simply say it now meets the Radio Equipment Directive? And the answer is no, not without some sort of effort or consideration, and probably testing. And this is because the testing requirements in almost all cases have changed. There are these additional receiver tests. Every type of product has a new standard. Firstly, of course, there's the admin part of having to reissue a standard because the old standard referenced the R&TTE Directive and the new standard must reference the RED. But in the reissuing of those standards, new tests have appeared. So any product which will be or is still being placed on the market after the 13th of June 2017 must be reassessed to the latest requirements. Really, this is no different to, let's turn back the clock a few years to where we're on the R&TTE Directive. We're just sailing along happily. We've tested our product to a harmonized standard. We've issued our DOC. Everybody's happy. And then ETSI put out a new harmonized standard. And we typically have a transition period in which we reassess our product to the new standard, and we change the standard number on our DOC, and we keep selling our product. It's no different to that. It's the only difference, of course, is that there are slightly more changes, and it's the name of the directive as well as the name of the standards you're changing. Okay, so my product is already on the market. So does this new RED problem really apply to me? Well, if you stop selling the product before the 12th of June 2017, you do not need to reassess it to the RED. As I mentioned before, you don't need to go out there and recall products from the market. But if you continue to supply units of that model from the 13th of June 2017 onwards, then yes, it does apply to you. My product was already compliant to the R&TTE Directive, so can I simply say it now meets the RED based on old testing? Well, no. As we've seen from the previous slides, it will need to be reassessed. Importantly, the latest technical requirements for meeting the RED are generally tougher than the old R&TTE requirements. So it's going to be pretty rare that you can sort of just look and say, okay, nothing to do. There are a few occasions where you might find it. You know, if you've got a higher powered wireless LAN device, for example, and you've already done adaptivity testing and blocking testing, you look through the standard and you might find that some of the test methods have changed, but actually the tests are not too different. How do I know what testing to do? Well, you're going to find those harmonized standards for testing. And the harmonized standards are on the official journal. And these are the most simple way to show compliance with the directive. So if you test to a harmonized standard, it gives you presumption of conformance and you can just sell your product. But unfortunately, right now, that's not possible for most products because there are not that many harmonized standards on the official journal at this time. The official journal, these are the standards which provide a presumption of conformity. Just because you see the word harmonized in the title of a document isn't enough. It needs to be listed on the official journal, and so I've provided a link to that at the bottom of this slide. Okay, a quick look at standards timeline. Well, right now, as of this morning, there are 23 standards listed on the official journal, and none of the really common ones. Well, I guess it depends who you are. You know, some people would look and say, well, my standards are all there, so I'm happy. But if you really think about, you know, EN 300, 328 and 301.893 for Wi-Fi, and 300, 220 or 300, 440 for short-range devices, none of those are on there. So for the most common products, they don't appear yet. But at least 73 standards have been published, and they'll hopefully appear on the next official journal. And at least 62 are in the final approval stages, and at least 35 are approved and just need formatting. So you can see the speed at which the standards are being added now. Will the new RED standards be different to the old R&TTE standards? Well, yep, I'm labouring the point, but only because this is the question I'm getting the most. In most cases, or almost all cases, they will. Even if you have a standard like 300, 328, and even if you did receive a blocking before, when you compare the standards side by side, you'll realize that the new blocking test is slightly different to the old blocking test. So you could say, well, we've just tested our product and we covered all those tests, but you need to look very carefully at those test cases and realize that actually the new tests are typically tougher than the old ones. And in all cases where receiver tests didn't appear before, receiver tests have now been added. And spectrum sharing tests may have been included too. New standards must be created for some devices. So, for example, broadcast receivers, television and radio, they didn't have any radio equipment directive or radio performance standards before, so those are being written from scratch. And GNSS or GPS receivers, again, they're being written from scratch. Now, I was at ETSI just last week. The thing you got to think about for TV broadcast receivers is that they've gone from this big wide analog band to quite a narrow digital band, and LTE is being squeezed in all around it. And it's quite likely that these television sets just may not have been designed to deal with that. So I think that's going to be a difficult time ahead for television receiver manufacturers. GNSS or GPS receivers, I see some people on this group here who might have an interest in GPS, and amazingly, nobody turned up to write that standard. So you had a very small number of people trying to write a standard, and I hope they won't mind me saying, they didn't really know what they were doing. They were new to ETSI. They didn't get perhaps the support they should have got. And so even the draft GPS or GNSS receiver standard right now, they kind of presented it to the world last week, and it was immediately obvious that there are lots of tests missing. So that's a very immature standard, and it's simply because nobody's been going to ETSI to help write it. In addition to the red changes, some companies have really leapt on this opportunity. There are manufacturers or test labs who for years wanted to make a change to a harmonized standard, and maybe they've gone to ETSI and ETSI has said, no, it's too small a change. But now all of a sudden they've gone in and said, okay, you're making the change to the standard, I want to make my changes now. So you have the situation where ETSI is trying to incorporate these red changes, and also people are chipping in with their new test methods. Okay, so could my product fail these new tests? Well, yes, of course, it's very likely, especially if your product was not originally designed to comply. Receiver tests have been added, and these may have not been tested before. Now, I look on the list of attendees here, and I can see some companies, maybe licensed transmitter products. And the funny thing is that 20 or so years ago, before the R&TTE Directive came along, to get that product radio type approved, you might well have had to do some receiver testing. And those receiver tests were taken out of the standards when the R&TTE Directive came along. That was really the scope of the notified body's original identification of test suites role, where the standard might have included transmitter and receiver tests, but it was the notified body's role to say, don't worry, you only need to do the transmit tests. So over the last 16 or so years, they've fallen out of the standards, and now ETSI are scrabbling around on the floor trying to find them and shoehorn them back in again. And one interesting question at ETSI last week was, who chooses the limits? Who chooses the thresholds for these new receiver tests? And it's, of course, whoever turns up to ETSI, which is typically a mixture of manufacturers and spectrum regulators. And so you can imagine that they start off haggling, and then they meet a case in the middle. And you like to think that it's also based on some pretty intelligent co-location and cooperation research, and not just a whimsical guess. So I think receiver tests have been added. TV broadcast receivers are expected to have trouble. FM radio receivers I feel a little sorry for, because they're going to suddenly have lots of testing, but they're really quite a low-cost product, and they've never had any interference problems. So that's a bit of a shame for them, you could say. GNSS receivers, typically they have very good performance, because you stick these chipsets in a mobile phone and it's surrounded by transmitters, and so typically a GNSS or GPS receiver has the software capability within the chipset to have great receiver performance. And research has shown that if the installer leaves that software in the chipset, then it should pass the test. But if you have GPS only on a product, then sometimes the installer strips that away and it could fail. And then of course you have like the licensed wireless WAN devices, and for the most part, they're going to have receiver testing as part of their GCF or PTCRB anyway, and so not too much problem for those tests to be put back into the EN standard. Will I need to perform these new tests? Well, yes, there'll be mandatory test cases for meeting the directive. Receiver performance was non-mandatory quality issue in the past. Well, yeah, but now it's part of the RED. It comes from the directive, and it's unavoidable. Can a notified body help me? Well, yes, a notified body can issue a certificate to the RED based on testing or assessment. So, for example, if you've done some testing, it could be a RED standard harmonized on the OJ, or it's published as a harmonized document but not yet on the OJ, or it could even be just a varying Word draft document. And the notified body can help you, and that's extremely helpful right now. If you have a standard that's not on the official journal that you really want to declare your product to the RED, then you're going to need a notified body, and we're all here to help. But however, you can't just go to a notified body and say, look, I'm not going to test those receiver tests, but can you give me a certificate anyway? That's not how it works. The notified body is going to have to say, well, okay, we're going to have to, look for equivalent testing. Or if you say, I'm sorry, but I haven't got a harmonized standard yet, so do I just proceed without it? Well, the answer is, well, no. We're going to have to make up some test cases that would be representative of what might appear in the final standard. There is guidance on what type of tests should appear in the standards. Do I need to fully retest all aspects of the new standard, or can I just do partial testing? Well, I would say partial testing is okay. For me, if I was a manufacturer, if you look through the standards side by side and all the transmitter output power and bandwidth and frequency accuracy and spurious emissions, if they're all identical and all you've got is the inclusion of one or two new receiver tests, well, I would just do those receiver tests. I wouldn't repeat the old testing just so that I could get a nice new standard listed on my test report. Unless, of course, that's a marketing advantage for you, and that's your own decision. If a test method has changed and becomes less severe, well, and you might be able to therefore deviate from the new standard and go to a notified body and say, well, I saved a lot of money by not fully retesting to the new standard, but I didn't follow the harmonized new standard, so can you issue a certificate? And if your old testing is considered more severe than the new requirements, then I'm sure the notified body would be happy to do that. If the radio test standard is not yet listed on the RED OJ, must I use a notified body? And the answer is yes. You can't state compliance to the directive without a notified body if you have not used a radio standard that's listed on the RED official journal. You do not need a notified body for test reports to non-harmonized EMC or safety standards, however. Harmonized standards for testing. What if some of my standards are listed on the OJ and some are not? Well, you can ask the notified body to just review the radio part. You could say, look, I've got a product here. Please just review radio. Don't review EMC and safety. You can ask them to assess the whole thing if you like, and that's really the most common thing. But if you want to save some time and maybe you're scared the notified body will find something wrong, then you could ask them not to look at EMC and safety. However, if your product contains multiple radios, let's say you have Bluetooth and 5 gig Wi-Fi, and you go and you say, look, my Bluetooth standard is harmonized, but my 5 gig Wi-Fi standard isn't. Can you just assess the 5 gig Wi-Fi, please? I'm afraid the answer this time is going to be no. The notified body would have to review all radio aspects. They can't split it up. That will be clarified in the RED guide, I hope, but this is what we're being told it will say. Will all the standards be ready in time for the RED deadline of the 13th of June? Well, some of them, yes, but some of them definitely no. A classic example is the 5 gigahertz wireless LAN standard, which will not be ready. Just last week, the first draft version became stable enough to be PDF'd and available on the web, on the internet, but that's still in draft form. Many of them will be ready, but only just before the deadline. For example, 300.328 is now published as a final document. It's not listed on the OJ yet, but I suspect it will be very soon. 300-220 is expected around May 2017. Okay, so what should a manufacturer think about, or what should a notified body think about reviewing the technical documentation? Well, firstly, compare the old test standard to the new test standard. Perform any testing if needed. Now, this might be something the manufacturer can do, and they might decide to compare the standards side by side themselves if they have a good understanding, or they might need to go to the test lab and ask for help on that, or on the notified body. So we're doing a lot of that work ourselves at the moment, where people would come and they would ask us to help them research the difference between the old standard and the new standard. If the standard will be on the official journal before the 13th of June, you could test to it now, and then as soon as it becomes listed on the official journal, sign your declaration of conformity and sell it without the notified body. Or you can get a notified body certificate right now. If the standard will not be on the official journal before the 13th of June, even if the standard is published, you're going to need a notified body certificate if you want to keep selling your product. Okay, then can I relax? Well, maybe not. If you assess your product to a draft standard now and you get a notified body certificate, well, what happens as that standard evolves and then becomes finally published? Well, actually, any change in the standard triggers a reassessment. If there are no changes, then you could say that you meet the new standard and your notified body would probably be happy with that. But if there are changes, then as the draft standard evolves, you might find yourself having to keep retesting. Okay, harmonized standards get updated. When a standard is harmonized and published on the OJ, it has a transition period of 1 or 2 years if a new one comes out. But manufacturers have a difficult problem right now, because if they use a draft standard right now, and then next month ETSI put out a new draft version, well, there won't be a transition. And if you get a notified body certificate right now to a new draft standard, and then next month a new draft comes out, that will invalidate the certificate. Well, yes, that is true. The notified body community, through the Radio Equipment Directive Compliance Association, have sent a request to the EU Commission to ask permission for us notified bodies to put an 18-month transition period onto our certificates, such that if we had a draft standard now and we issue a certificate right now to allow the manufacturer to sell, and then ETSI changed that draft, there should be, we feel, a transition period in our certificate. Legally, that doesn't exist at the moment, but we've asked the Commission to allow for it. Okay, then can I relax? Well, maybe not again. So in a push to get the Radio Equipment Directive standards issued and out on the OJ as soon as possible, there was a lot of people saying, look, rather than spend all this time getting the standards perfect, can't you just put out a reasonable standard, you know, even something that's a bit like the old R&TTE standard, but not quite? And so ETSI has said, okay, we'll do that. So they're putting out some standards in a kind of halfway there or not quite perfect way, which is good news for getting the standard done quickly. But then, of course, you've got to remember that there will need to be a version 2 following soon after, where they make the standard better. And that would probably be arriving within the next year or two. So if you have a standard like, I believe, 300-328 or 300-220, they're just getting a reasonable standard on the internet for us right now, and then they'll immediately continue work to get a perfect one appearing in the next couple of years. Okay, where can I find details to track my standard? This link is very useful. You click on that and it shows you the development of all the standards, and you can search on the old R&TTE version or the Radio Equipment Directive version. If anybody has a problem searching on that, just let me know. Any standards to worry about? Well, yep, I've mentioned GNSS receivers where really nobody turned up to contribute, and the standard is missing some pretty important tests. 5 gig Wi-Fi, there's just a lot of work to do on that standard, and so that's going to be late. GSM or GPRS, the old 2G, 301.511, there's just so much focus on LTE that really nobody put much thought on that standard, so that's quite late. And some of the EN 301.489 EMC standards have simply not been started purely because nobody's turned up. ETSI standards are all contribution driven, so if you use an ETSI standard, one of those EMC ones, it's very important for you to go and check in case you need it. If nobody's been turning up to write it, there could be a gap there. Okay, nearly at the end. Sorry, I'm overrunning. All this talk of radio standards, does it mean there's no change for EMC and safety? Well, not quite. The essential requirements may not have changed so significantly for EMC and safety, but there are still changes which affect them. Safety was the change in scope we mentioned. Safety tests may not have changed, but you do need to think about animals, protection of property, and a reasonably foreseen use of a product. EMC. Now, you need to look at those EN 301 489 standards. 489-1, for example, the main one. Radiated emissions goes up to 6 gigahertz, but also radiated immunity only went up to 2.7 gigahertz with a big gap in it previously, whereas the new red version goes all the way up, radiated immunity up to 6 gigahertz with no gaps. So that's new EMC testing required for all products. Okay, where are the EMC and safety standards? Well, surely they're not listed on the red OJ. Anyone can see that. So where are they? Well, the original idea was to not list them on the red OJ because they figured it would make the red OJ huge. Then there was a call to list them, and so the story I've been given is that every safety standard you can possibly imagine was thrown at the European Commission to put onto the red OJ, and it was so many they just said, look, you know, take them back, sort them out, and only send us the relevant ones. So all in all, it's not happening. Or if it is happening, it's certainly not happening yet. But that's okay. You can go to the EMC Directive and Low Voltage Directives official journals, and you can take the relevant EMC and safety products from those directives to use for your product. Because they're not listed on the red OJ, they do not give you presumption of conformity, and so you would have to have some sort of internal justification for it. But that's okay. You can do that, and it doesn't mandate a notified body use. Okay, well, finally, good luck. So I mentioned EMC and safety at the end there, but radio performance is obviously the main feature. So we're 6 months to go. We're halfway through the transition period, but I don't see much activity. Lots of discussions. I'm spending all day, every day, replying to people's questions about what do I do and which standard do I look at, but people are still waiting a little bit. I think it's like they're playing chicken or poker. They're kind of waiting till the last minute. Do they move now, test to a draft standard, get a type examination certificate so they can sell their product, but then it might mean that they have to do some more testing or sales later on, which might be expensive, but it might be safe? Or do they hold on and hold on and hold on and try and just do everything in the last weeks, which might be great because they only test once and they save a load of money, or it might be really bad if they suddenly find all the test labs are booked up and notified bodies are busy. So I would just say that's a commercial decision on a business-by-business basis. Okay, so I apologize, I've moved a bit quickly at the end there. I obviously talked too slowly at the beginning. I've had 2 questions come in, and then I will ask Christine if any other questions have come in. So the first question I've received is, how does self-declaration to the red work? Well, very simply, you assess your product to the essential requirements, the radio, safety, and EMC aspects. In the future, when everything's nice and neat, you would use fully harmonized standards for that. But as we saw here, you might need to use draft standards and help of a notified body. And then once you've got that, either your test reports to harmonized standards or some test reports and a notified body certificate. And by the way, you can test to harmonized standards and get a notified body certificate just to give you some confidence, if you like. And then once you do that, you would create your own declaration of conformity, and there's a draft template of that in the red itself. You place the CE mark on your product, and you start selling it. There's no equivalent to the FCC where you would upload documents or have an FCC ID or any sort of online certification or anything like that. The next question is, how do I find out if my product is Class 1 or Class 2? Well, this is a very good question and something I haven't really put on my slides here. So under the R&TTE Directive, a Class 1 product is something that can be switched on anywhere without restriction. So it can be used indoors or outdoors. It can be used in a harmonized frequency band, There's a list of Class 1 devices on the European Commission's website. And if you type in R&TTE Directive into Google, and you look for the link which is called Europa, and you go on there and you scroll down, and you'll see Class 1 devices, and it will list all of the Class 1 devices. And the definition of a Class 2 device is a device which isn't Class 1. So basically, if your product isn't on the Class 1 list, then you're Class 2. But interestingly, there's a list of some, there's a Class 2 list, but that's not an exhaustive list. It's a list of common, most typical Class 2 devices. So if your device isn't on the Class 1 list and it isn't on the Class 2 list, then it's Class 2. Now be careful, because the Class 1 list for the R&TTE Directive cannot be simply transposed across to the RED because of this spectrum sharing issue, this efficient use of spectrum. There are some Class 1 products where it says they may have listen before talk or a low duty cycle, but under the RED they might be listen before talk and a low duty cycle. So they need to go through all of those subclasses of Class 1 and assess them one at a time. Okay, so I think that is me, unless Christine, do you have any more questions for me?
Hi, Michael. As a matter of fact, yes, we have a number of questions. Well, this is a jam-packed webinar, so
okay.
we have jam-packed questions.
Okay.
Some of these things I'm sure are going to be kind of a review, but I think it's a good thing. Let's start here. It says, if the manufacturer used a notified body to the RED on a product which was previously assessed to the R&TTE Directive, would they need to submit a full new test report with all new measurements for every test case?
Well, they need to provide evidence for all those test cases. So there's a few possibilities here. Let's say, for example, they already have the old test report from the old R&TTE product. They could give that old test report to the notified body, and then they could also give a partial test report to the new test cases. And let's remember, by the way, you don't need to use an accredited test lab. I apologize to any of the accredited test labs on the webinar, but you know, if you're a manufacturer and you've got a full test report for your old R&TTE testing, if you're able to do those new receiver tests on your bench in your lab, then that's okay. And you could go to the notified body and say, here's my old R&TTE test report, and here's a few pages of my new RED receiver performance testing. Could I have a certificate, please? And most likely the notified body would be able to review that as a whole. You wouldn't need a completely repackaged new test report. You wouldn't need one big final test report that contains everything. You could have partial testing that's new and full testing that's old. Alternatively, if you've gone to a notified body in the past and you've had an assessment, you could say, well, look, here's my old notified body opinion, especially if you're going back to the same notified body. You could say, look, you've reviewed it before. Here's your old notified body opinion. And here are just my new tests. I've been to my bench in my office, or I've been to my local accredited or non-accredited test lab. I've been given a partial test report for the missing tests. You've already got the old test results, and here's your old notified body opinion. Please now give me a certificate to the RED. So that would be okay also.
Okay. Our next question, would my notified body or TCB notify me out of the products they've certified, which ones will need to be retested?
That's an interesting question. I assume they mean, will they, if the notified body has assessed to the R&TTE Directive in the past and given a notified body opinion in the past, will the notified body inform me now that they need a retest for the RED? And I would say probably not. I would say that most notified bodies have been informing the industry about these changes from the R&TTE to the RED, but I don't think there's a requirement that they have to go back and tell them all. Now, moving forward, it is slightly different. So let's say now a notified body issues a certificate to the RED. Let's say a harmonized standard comes up, There is a requirement in the future for notified bodies to inform their customers if those further requirements change within the RED. It's not exactly clear yet how notified bodies should do that, but moving forward, yeah, the notified body is expected to have a little bit more involvement in keeping up to date on the compliance of the products they've issued a certificate for. So yeah, I would say in general, if you're a product manufacturer and you're selling under the R&TTE Directive right now, you won't be approached directly by your notified body, but you must assume that yes, you do need to retest and reassess and meet the RED. But moving forward, there might be a little bit more engagement from notified bodies under the RED. Okay.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, next question. If a manufacturer wants to get a notified body type examination certificate to the RED for their product and put the notified body's number on the label of their product, is that okay?
No, it's not okay. Thank you. A good question, but it's not okay because we get people, some people are overjoyed that they can finally take that notified body number off of their product. They've not liked that number, they thought it looked ugly, and they're very excited to take it off. Other people have really become quite comfortable with that notified body number being on the product, and they're a little bit sad and blue now that they have to take it off. And a few people have said, well, can we put it on anyway, just because we want to? But the answer is no, because it would actually give a false message. It would tell surveillance that the full quality assurance route had been followed, which would not be correct.
Okay, next question is a good segue. Can you give an example of why someone might choose full quality assurance route?
That's a good question. I think if it tends to be some of the real large mobile phone manufacturers in the past have done it. I'll be honest, I've never worked with a manufacturer who's used the full quality assurance route. It's quite onerous. It's one of those things where you have to put a lot of effort into starting it up in the first place. You have to have your full quality assurance in place, and you have to set an agreement up with the notified body and with your accreditation body and everything in the first place. But then once the hard work is done and it's all set up, then the product by product changes become a little easier over time. I guess it's a bit like buying a diesel car. You pay out big in the first place, but you save a bit of money every time you fill it up.
Okay. Let's see, next question. If a manufacturer has a product which may only be used in a small number of EU countries, is the country notification process still available under the RED?
Yeah, not only is it not needed, but it's actually not available. So it will literally go away, and the manufacturer is expected to do all that research themselves. Interestingly, the European Commission told notified bodies recently that the notified body should not do that research for the manufacturer because it's the manufacturer who is ultimately and legally responsible for that, and the notified body will be expected to review it if you ask a notified body for a certificate. And so it's that situation where you'd be effectively marking your own homework.
Okay, we've got about 4 more questions, if that's okay.
It's perfectly okay with me. I do apologize to everybody that I'm keeping.
That's okay. I think this is good information, so everybody's probably going to stick around to hear the rest.
Sure.
All right, so this next question's kind of a two-parter. So, will notified bodies issue certificates before the RED guide is formalized, or will industry have to wait for the RED guide to be complete? Also, if a draft standard is not expected to be published in time, is it possible to review a draft to get an idea of the expected requirements?
Yeah, okay, perfect. A very good question. So I'll start with the guide. I would say you can use the guide that exists right now, even though it's, to quote my terms, very draft. Use it because it is the latest state of the art. This isn't like the FCC or Industry Canada or Japan or something where you have to only work on formal documents or issued or approved documents. With the European approach, you do your best. You go to battle with the army you've got, and you do your best with the tools you have at your hands. So as a manufacturer, I would say look at that new RED guide and see and follow the guidance of it. But always keep in mind that as the red guide progresses, some of the things you've done might change, and that's okay. You know, if you've issued a DOC to your product and you follow the latest guide, and then the guide changes, and so at the speed that you can, you make those changes. You know, market surveillance is not going to hammer you for that. We had a conversation with market surveillance recently. I'm going off topic, but I will come back. We had a discussion with market surveillance, and we said, look, how strict are you going to be, really? You know, 14th of June, 2007, you finished your breakfast, you had your coffee, how does your day look? How busy are you? And they've said, look, you know, we're only interested in people who've done nothing, people who've made no effort. They've just changed the number on their DOC and watch the money come in. You know, so if a manufacturer has done something, done their best, let's say they've used the draft guidance, draft red guide, they've made the appropriate changes for that, and then let's say the draft guide changes, so in time they've made their changes, and there's going to be some products out there, it's a little bit higgledy-piggledy, but they've done their best. Those people are not going to get into trouble. And I see some notified bodies on this call, and I would say exactly the same to the notified bodies. Use that draft guide. If a manufacturer comes to you for a type examination certificate, use that guide, follow it. It's the latest state of the art, and it's the tool that's available to you as a notified body to use. I would recommend you kind of give your customer a heads up and a note that say, look, this is based on draft guidance, and please understand that it could change. And again, nobody's going to criticize the notified body for following the draft guide because it's the latest state of the art and it's the best we've got. And as long as we all understand that it could change. And I think if you could repeat the second part of the question, please, Christine. I think it was about the standard.
Yes. It said also if the draft standard is not expected to be published in time, is it possible to review a draft to get an idea of the expected requirements?
Yeah, definitely. And then you should look at the stage of the draft. So let's say, for example, you've got the 2.4 gig Wi-Fi standard right now. It's just been published. It's not a draft anymore. So we can all be quite confident that the one that appears on the OJ is probably going to be that one. And then you've got something like the 301.893, that's the 5 gig Wi-Fi standard. It's just last week been published as a draft document for the first time. So it's just made its first little leap from being a Word document with track changes on to being a PDF document you can take off the internet. So that's a big evolutionary leap for that standard. It's going to go for voting now, and it could change. But as an industry, that's the best we've got. So if you're a manufacturer, I would say use that standard. And if you're a notified body, I would say use that standard. But I would also say keep an eye on what should be in an ETSI standard. So ETSI have a guidance document which tells the groups what should be in their standards. And it includes like the basic test cases that should appear in each one. Now the group that are writing the 5 gig Wi-Fi standard, they're a pretty mature ETSI group. And I'm very confident that they will have thought of all these things. And so probably low risk there. But by contrast, you've got things like the GPS or GNSS receiver group. There is a basic draft to that standard. It's very basic. It's a Word document with track changes on. If you were to take that standard and compare that to the ETSI guidance document on writing a red standard, you would immediately see that some tests are missing. So as a test lab, a manufacturer, a notified body, whoever, you would say, right, okay, we need to do some more than just the draft standard here. And I have my opinions on what a GNSS or GPS receiver manufacturer should do. So if anyone wants to, basically I would say follow the new standard and the old spurious emissions from the old 300/440. But there we go, that's my answer.
Okay. All right, next question. I really want to use my notified body's number on the product. What risks will this carry for market access?
Okay, well, I mean, it would be a formal non-compliance because you've labeled incorrectly. And so I suspect that will just be dependent on how market surveillance works. So you might get them. All member states in the EU have to perform market surveillance, and each year they have to tell the EU Commission what they've done. Some of the member states have got money and test labs. So those are the ones who are probably going to drag your product into a SAR lab or onto a radiated emissions site. Other EU countries have not got money and have not got test sites. So most likely they will be the sort of countries that will look at the labeling and the administrative non-compliances. So that would be an immediate thing that they could find. And I would make a note, by the way, that there's a clause in the red which says that if the market surveillance finds an administrative non-compliance with the product, then they can make the manufacturer pay for testing of that product for market surveillance. So you could argue it's low risk just to put the notified body number on, but you know, it could be high risk as well because it's an easy catch for a market surveillance company that's low on staff, low on money. It's an easy catch for them to just say, well, that's wrong, and then because they won't be expecting to see a notified body number on a product, they'll expect that to stop. So that's an easy catch, and it could suddenly cost you not only by your product being stopped at customs and held off the market, but also from you having to pay for surveillance to test it.
Okay. Would you give a brief summary of Article 3.3?
Yeah, sure. It's so Article 3.1a is safety requirements. Article 3.1b is the EMC requirements. Article 3.2 is the radio requirements. And Article 3.3, which I'm not an expert at, because it's just one of those ones that, you know, it's like a list of things that may be asked for or may be enacted. You know, there's things like interaction of products or the labeling of Class 2 devices. They're like acts that the EU Commission could bring on or off. And so right now you could look at Article 3.3 and say, God, that looks like a little shopping list of things that haven't really been enacted yet. And so, you know, the EU Commission could bring on those requirements at some point. You know, things like having a common charger for mobile phones, etc. Or registration, I think, also is in around there. So they're kind of almost little additional. They're not strictly safety. They're not strictly EMC. They're not strictly radio, but they are sort of essential requirements which the EU Commission can turn on or off through either implementing acts or delegating acts, which there's a slight difference between those.
Okay. With regards to the safety aspects, like the low voltage directive, can you discuss whether or not the safety extends beyond simply radio or electric safety to areas such as hazardous parts, etc., for example?
It definitely is product safety, of course, and it's also RF exposure. But so I guess, you know, within product safety, you certainly you know, you have things like hazardous, you know, flammability and sharp edges and electric shock and things like that. So people call, you know, standards like 60950 and 62368, people call them electrical safety standards, but really they are product safety standards with a heavy bias towards electricity, I would say. So as far as things like whether a material is bad for the environment, that would be covered under a different directive. That's more of your sort of ROS and WE and REACH and things like that. So there's sort of or ATEX and machinery directives. They would run in parallel. So if you've got a product which is a medical device with a radio in it, then the radio equipment directive would apply and the medical directive would apply. And so you'd have those running in parallel, and so the medical safety would exist as well. And the same if you have medical machinery. And so under the product safety aspects of the radio equipment directive, you know, you need to think about the electrical safety risks. You need to think about RF exposure. But yeah, you also do need to, I would say any kind of harm You know, like if a child can easily get the battery out and swallow it, then that's bad news for everybody. And so, you know, you do need to think about that. But then you would hope then if it was that kind of product, then it would be under the Toy Safety Directive as well.
Okay. You have time for two more?
Yeah.
Okay. Next question is, should the EN 301-489 standards be used for testing EMC or select appropriate EMCD standard?
Right, so I would say you've got to look at what your product does, and this kind of matches as well. Questions just popped up on my screen. Somebody's just asked, can I claim compliance to 3.1A safety and 3.2B EMC through the IEC 60601-1 standards as medical? So you've got to think about what your product is and what it does. Now, if it's just a simple radio product, then you're going to test to those EN 301-489 standards. If you have a multi-functioning product, let's say I've got a laptop here, so it could be a radio because it's got Wi-Fi, so I must test it to this 301-489-17. But when Wi-Fi isn't happening, then you've got to think of it as a laptop as well. So the EN 55032 and 55024 or 35 as it will be in the future, they'll need to be covered as well. And so you'll find yourself for a lot of products where you would have EMC testing of some operations would be to some standards and other operations would be to the radio standards. I've never liked the term primary function because a product is a product that can do all these things. And the classic example everyone likes to dig out is a washing machine that's got Wi-Fi. So you'll do EMC testing, and you might well just run one test to cover a few modes. You know, you might say, right, well, I'm testing the wireless link, and I'm also testing the spin cycle. And then you go, well, actually, I've got a lot of tests here because I've got to check that the Wi-Fi link works when it's not in a spin cycle and stuff like that. So you might find you've got the radio EMC standard and the product, if you like, EMC standard. And in response to the question about 60601-1, you know, you're looking at safety and EMC of the medical environment, and that is correct, but you also need to make sure you have assessed the radio performance to a level that's equivalent to those 301-893 or standards. So I guess in my summary answer to the original question would be, for the radio performance, you need to think about those 301-489 standards, but there will also be some EMC testing of any other functions, whether that's IT EMC standards or power tool standards or household appliance standards or medical machinery, etc.
Okay, yeah, cover all the bases for sure.
Yeah.
All right, looks like I've got one more question here. Does the alert symbol need to be removed from an existing product on the market after being reassessed to red?
Yes, correct, because the alert symbol will not exist under the red. So if you've got a licensed transmitter or a transmitter that cannot operate in every EU member state, presently you'll have the CE mark and the alert symbol on the label. And as you transition and you start using the Radio Equipment Directive, you must remove that alert symbol from your label.
Okay. Wow.
I had one more question here. There's one here. The question was, did I say that both draft and harmonized red standards are on the OJ? No. The way the standard evolution works is ETSI would write a standard. It would exist in a very fluid Word document form. Then it would become more and more stable until they feel confident to call it a published draft standard. Then it would get voted on, and if it voted positive, they remove the word draft and they call it just a final harmonized standard. And then the European Commission takes a look at it, and the European Commission decides if they're happy with it. And if the European Commission is happy with it, then they put it on the OJ or the official journal. So it would only ever be the final harmonized standard published and agreed on by the EU Commission. That would be the only document which appears on the OJ. all those previous ones, the drafts and the published draft and even the published final standard before it's accepted, they would not appear on the OJ. So if you go to the official journal looking for your draft standard, you won't find it. A few slides ago, there was a link to an Etsy page. That's where you would find the progress of your draft standards.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't seem to have any other questions in my queue. How about you?
I think we're done. Everybody's had enough. I would say about a good number of people stayed on, but certainly a number of people have dropped off, and I don't blame them. Yeah, I would. It's obviously difficult speaking to an empty screen for an hour or so, but I hope people have enjoyed it. I hope people have at least learned something. And one thing I always like to say with any training course or webinar I do is, look, I can't cover everything in this time, but you have my email address now, and this isn't a sales pitch. This is more just a, if you have questions from now on, you at least know who I am now, and feel free to contact me and ask me, and I'll do all I can to help.
Well, there you go. Awesome.
Okay.
Well, I appreciate it. I guess in just going to take a second and go over some upcoming training for Washington Labs Academy, if you don't mind.
No problem. I shall mute myself.
Okay. So you folks can link to us at wll.com/US/academy. You'll find information on all of our webinars and resident courses available on a variety of topics. Here are the last 4 sessions we have for 2016. We have Product Safety, Session 12, Routes to Compliance. That will begin Tuesday, December 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern. That would be, I guess, 7 p.m. European time. Mil Standard 461, EMC Military, Session 12 on Wednesday, December the 14th. We're covering documentation. Also on Wednesday, December 14th, starting at 3 p.m. Eastern, that's 9 p.m. European time, we have the Scientific Method and Project Management webinar with Laser Training and Safety Director, Mr. Peter Bowden. And the last webinar for the year will be on Thursday, December 15th, and that is on Mil Standard 810G, covering Mil Standards 167 and 901 with Mr. Steve Ferguson. Also listed here are a couple of happenings in 2017. Some of you might be interested in attending. The date is set for May 8th in San Jose, California for the 2017 IEEE Symposium on Product Safety Compliance Engineering. And in Washington, D.C., the IEEE EMC Signal and Power Integrity Symposium is happening the week of August the 7th. So all of the webinars and resident courses are available for purchase. If you're interested in checking out any of our previous webinars, please note that all are available for purchase from the Washington Labs Academy website. We also provide customized training at your place or ours. Webinars are available as multi-part series events, enabling you to pick and join in to discuss the finer details of any one of the course topics. So be sure to visit our webpage, check out our topics and dates. We'd also love to hear from you with suggestions on future topics that we might be able to present. So that is going to conclude today's webinar. On behalf of myself and the Washington Labs Academy, I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance. Michael Derby, thank you very much for a very interesting webinar. And at this point, I will go ahead and end the event. So I bid everyone a good day, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.